Hello, and welcome back to Season 5 of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm happy to go on this journey with you. We're coming up on the one-year anniversary of October the 7th, a cataclysmic event that punctured every corner of Israeli society and has left deep scars on many aspects of Israeli life, including the economy. And we're going to talk about the economy today. The Israeli economy is known for its extraordinary resilience and dynamism and has often recovered quickly from previous economic shocks and previous wars. Although Israel is only a nation of 9 million people, it's an economic powerhouse and a hub for innovation, earning its nickname, the Startup Nation. Israel's economy is no stranger to hardship, but close to a year of a multifront war have put significant strains on Israel's economic stability and have tested the limits of its economic resiliency. Extensive military spending, dwindling tourism and trade, and high compensation costs for reserve soldiers and families of terror victims have all reduced economic growth. The total cost of the Gaza war is just so far, and it's not over, estimated by some to be $120 billion, the equivalent of 20% of Israel's gross GDP, plus much more costs to come. Israel's economic difficulties are directly linked to an unstable security situation. The threat of further escalation with Iran and Hezbollah threaten to further extend economic slowdown. Domestic political decisions will also be crucial in impacting Israel's economic trajectory. How much of Israel's economic turbulence was triggered by a long and costly war, and to what extent has this economic damage been exacerbated by poor policy decisions? What is Israel's path forward for economic recovery? For this conversation, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Karnit Flug, Vice President of Research at the Israel Democracy Institute and former head of the Bank of Israel. That's Israel's Federal Reserve or central bank. Karnit completed a 5-year term as the governor of the Bank of Israel in 2018, during which he repeatedly received public acclaim as one of the world's top central bankers. Karnit, welcome to Decision Points.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, we're delighted to have you. This program is different than some of the others which deal more with the geopolitics of the war and all its complications, but it's no less integral, which is the economic impact of the war, primarily on Israel, but we'd like to talk about how you see it with the Palestinians, with the Arab world, and with the whole macroeconomic environment where Israel exists. So I'll just start, if you had to summarize, what are the biggest wartime strains of a war that's gone on now for close to a year?
Yeah, I think that I can divide the strains in two areas. One is on the economic activity. And following a sharp drop in the last quarter of 2023, there was a mild recovery in the overall activity, but there are some sectors that are most severely affected, like construction sector, that is an important sector in the Israeli economy, and that is very dependent on Palestinian workers and on foreign workers. The level of activity there had fallen sharply because of the absence of both. Then there is the agricultural sector, which has been affected because most of the land that is cultivated is around the borders, around the Gaza Strip, and also in the north. And so a lot of these areas, it's not possible to actually do the work there, and they're also dependent on Palestinian workers. And of course, tourism, which is naturally now almost non-existent on very, very low. These are sort of the sectors that are most affected. But if you look at the overall activity, so if before the war, there was expectation that the economy or the GDP will grow by something like around 3%. Now the revised projections are talking about maybe 1.5%, which may sound not terrible, but it's quite a blow in the sense that if you take into account that the Israeli population grows by 2% a year, so growing by 1.5% means that actually there is a contraction in per capita GDP. So it's quite substantial slowdown. It's not a recession, but of course, whether it turns into a recession will depend on how things evolve. So that's in terms of the economic activity. The other aspect of the effect on the economy is the budget and the costs. And obviously, the fact that it has been a long war means that the costs are very high. The costs in terms of the direct cost on munition, on reservists, and so on, and also the civilian costs, which are related to the fact that there is a very large displaced population that needs to be helped in different ways. Right now, as a result of that, there is a very large budget deficit. Currently, it's projected to be 6.6% of GDP, but I think there is a risk that it will be higher than that.
And in a normal year, what is it usually?
About 3%, 2-3% of GDP. And there is the cost of financing it, the risk premium, and so on. So maybe we can talk about that later.
So I want to unpack some of this because each one of these elements seem like they could be very significant. For example, the fact that the North and the South, the people are displaced from their homes in Israel. I don't know the number. Sometimes we hear 60,000 in the South, 80 in the North. Maybe it's a little different from that. But it's also not just people have to find another place to live, but they're now disconnected from where they worked. And maybe in the North, the economy doesn't even function because people have left. That part alone of having people displaced that way, could you give us a sense of what is the magnitude of that?
So in terms of the overall effect on the economy, first of all, I can't really quantify it. And obviously, beside the economic aspect, there is huge human suffering of people who are displaced from their homes, who don't know whether the school year will start or not start, and they're in hotels. Some of them can get to their work, some of them can't get to their workplace. In terms of the overall effect on the macroeconomy, maybe it's not huge, and it hasn't been quantified so far. And I don't know what the proportion of people who are actually working or working distant work. The budgetary cost so far has been estimated to be something like 23 billion shekels or $6 billion. But that's, I think, only partial. It's only the direct cost. It's the compensation and maintaining these people in hotels and so on. But I think there are many other costs that are not yet actually known, like medical expenditure and psychological help. There are a lot of other costs that we don't yet know. I think maybe the most concerning issue about that is that the uncertainty about the future and whether the sense of security will be restored makes it very unclear whether these people will actually get back to their communities, and the communities are slowly dismantling. It's hard to see it as a macroeconomic cost, but I think there are huge costs that maybe can't yet be quantified.
We hear stories that, like, whether it's Metula, Manara, Kiryat Shmona, there are communities where there's a lot of physical damage. And I should say, we know in Lebanon, there's a lot of physical damage in southern Lebanon too. But is there any sense of what it would cost to rebuild?
The 23
Would
billion
include that?
shekel include that. But I think rebuilding houses and infrastructure is the smaller part of the costs. And I think the other costs, which actually the fact that many people may choose not to go back there. How do you rebuild a community which is sort of disintegrating because of uncertainty and because of the sense of lack of security? I think this is a concern for the longer term.
Yeah, which is the North going to be what it was? Is the OTEF, the Gaza envelope, going to be what it was? What does it mean for Israel if they're not? I mean, some of these are economic questions, but there's a lot of non-economic.
Yeah, I think it goes beyond the direct economic questions.
Yeah. On the productivity issue, I mean, we hear about a lot of people being called up multiple times for reserve duty. We wonder, what is the cost to Israel's productivity?
First of all, it's very uneven in terms of the sectors. And one of the sectors that has been most directly affected or more severely affected by people called on reserve is actually the high tech, because its population is relatively young. The proportion of people called on reserve is quite significant. It's quite disruptive. Again, to say what will be the effect on productivity is very hard to say. I know that there is shortage of workers in some sectors, including in the high-tech sector. The other side is that the labor market in general is very tight now, and you see very low unemployment rate and rising wages because the labor market is tight. So you have this sort of maybe surprising effect that usually tight labor market is associated with very positive economic circumstances. Now it's partly because of this shortage of workers due to reserve duties and due to the fact that Palestinian workers are not there.
I was going to ask you about what are the big surprises, and you're saying that one of the big surprises is the fact that all these people being called to reserve duty, there's not a lot of slack in the labor market.
That's right. And actually, at the beginning of the war, in October, you saw unemployment broadly defined was about 10%, but now it's a level of around 3%, which is below what it was before the war.
Wow.
Yeah.
Before the war, you said it was at what?
Around 3%. Yeah.
And now it's even lower than that.
Yeah, the last figure I saw was 2.8%. But,
that's amazing.
But yeah, so unemployment is very low and wages are going up.
Other surprises for you as an economist who's seen it all, who's seen Israel at different times? What you're describing is very interesting about the labor market. Are there other things that said, wow, I didn't expect this?
Well, I'm not sure it's a surprise. One, I can call it maybe a silver lining, is a very substantial increase in the demand for defense exports. So this is, in a way, a mitigating factor in terms of the overall activity and exports and so on. So that's sort of, I guess, from an economic standpoint, it's a positive development. But other than that, I have to say that the current war is different than the previous rounds that we've seen. It's much, much longer. And I am concerned that the effects on the economy would be much more significant. Maybe another, if you're looking for surprises, actually, maybe one can also mention the exchange rate, which has been relatively stable.
Yes.
The exchange rate against the dollar went up to about 4 at the very beginning of the war, but then it went back down to where it is now.
About 3.7, plus minus.
It's fluctuating, but not
shekels to dollar.
Right, not huge fluctuations. One could say that it's an indication of the resilience of the economy. But actually here we have to be a little bit careful, because in the past, when the stock market in the US was doing very well, usually it would cause a strengthening of the shekel. The stock market here had a very strong boom until recently, and we haven't seen the strengthening of the shekel. Other things are not equal, so it's a little bit tricky to actually. It's true that the shekel has been relatively stable, but there are forces that without the effects of the war would probably have strengthened it quite significantly.
Very interesting. You mentioned the high-tech sector, and some wonder, look, it doesn't matter. It's not agriculture or tourism or those who were not called up for reserve duty. They can work anywhere. So I'm curious if you feel the high-tech sector has been immune to the war, or do you say, look, high-tech relies on a lot of foreign direct investment, venture capital, and venture capitalists, they hear the word war and they get scared away. And in that regard, the high-tech sector is not being showered with the love of all this money pouring into Israel that has been the case that made it the startup nation.
Yeah, so I think it's still too early to judge what will be the longer-term effect on the high-tech sector. It's true that it has been affected by the absence of people called on reserve. We have seen a decline in the venture capital flowing in. Actually, the decline started before the war.
It was during the controversial judicial overhaul.
That's right. That's when we saw a sharp decline. But there was a sharp decline everywhere. Just in Israel, it was sharper during the year 2023. There was a peak in 2022 and a decline in 2023 everywhere. But the decline in Israel was sharper, and the fact that it went down more in Israel than in other places was attributed to the judicial overhaul. And then it didn't continue to decline. It more or less leveled off at the same level. But looking to the future, I think the question is how the war will evolve and how will be the security situation assessed will have an effect on longer-term attractiveness of investment in Israel in general and also in the high-tech sector, obviously.
I got to believe for Israeli businessmen, it's not easy when a lot of these air carriers have stopped flying, direct flights. I heard stories of Israeli businessmen, maybe not exclusively for this reason, relocating even to Cyprus just because if they have to travel. I'm embarrassed to say in the U.S., we have a lot of American companies that stop flying, but Air Dubai, Etihad, the Arab Emirates, they keep flying. So I don't know if that's a factor, but I do want to ask you about the regional piece of this, which is, we saw Erdogan in Turkey. Erdogan said, I'm not going to export to Israel. And we hear that maybe there's ways around this, but that the Turks export a lot of construction to Israel. And that is a way that keeps apartment prices at a certain level. And I don't know if housing prices have gone up because of the, you could say, look, it's not just about the Turks. It's if you don't have workers. And since October 7th, the Palestinian workers have not been able to work in Israel the way they did. There's a few factors that contribute to issues in the construction sector. So I guess when I think of like regional influences, I'm thinking of the impact of Turkey's decision, the impact of the Red Sea shipping that's related to Houthis. And, it's not directly related to Israel, but certainly if you're Egypt, a lot of your revenue goes through the Suez Canal. So I'm just trying to think of to what extent is the regional dimension impacted the Israeli economy?
Yeah, so of course the shipping prices went up as a result of the Houthis attacks. Israel construction sector was really very dependent on raw materials and materials from Turkey. So there was a diversion now to other sources. And by the way, some of them are still materials from Turkey, but going through a third country. But it does raise the cost. So that obviously is another strain on the construction sector. And the main issue, Israel's population grows by 2% a year. So in order to just supply enough new homes, you need to build something like 60 or 70,000 units every year.
Just to keep
just
even.
to keep enough new units for the new households. The fact that we have such a disruption in construction now will have an effect on prices. We have seen housing prices going up, and that will probably go on for quite a while because, it means that the construction, even the units that were started to be built, it will take longer, and I expect that to have a longer-term effect on housing prices.
That will keep them higher than usual in that regard?
There will be periods of shortage, which means that it will push prices higher up.
Right.
Yeah.
And workers, the fact that Palestinians are, not working October 7th. And we had heard Thai workers, if some of them were taken captive in Gaza and then released, I don't know if they're still coming in. Has Israel found a replacement? Some people say they're coming from India or Sri Lanka. Is Israel getting workers in the construction areas from other places?
Certainly not in the numbers that are needed. And you actually hear it from construction companies that they complain bitterly about the shortage of workers. The issue of whether to allow certain Palestinian workers that go through a security check, whether they should be allowed in. That's something that needs to be discussed because the ability to actually replace them by tens of thousands, that are needed has not proven itself so far.
It's ironic that the Palestinians do seem to be allowed to work in settlements. We see this from the governmental figures, but not inside Green Line Israel, so to speak. Okay, now the defense area. There's different layers of this, but one issue is that, I was just thinking of this today, that there was been Israeli complaints about the U.S. resupply of weapons, the speed of it. Now, some say, no, it's mostly just the 2,000-pound bombs. The others, were fast-tracked at the beginning of the war. President Biden sent everything he could in those early days. Now there's fast track is now a more regularized process, so the Israelis think it's a slowdown. Maybe it's not a slowdown, but it's not a fast track. So the issue of Israel's defense industry, people say, look, Elbit and some of these companies are working 24 hours around the clock to do what it can when it comes to ammunition. Is Israel's defense industry at the right size? Do you think that after the war, there's going to be some rethink, maybe the defense industry has to get bigger? Or are you going to say, look, whatever comes from the United States is ultimately, it comes sometimes as grants often. And so there's no Israeli defense industry can work that way anyway. So that's not going to be the difference maker here.
Well, I don't think that Israel can be, in that sense, self-sufficient. And also, it's probably not efficient because, we don't have the comparative advantage in building a huge, much, much bigger defense industry. So there will probably be some changes, but I think that our need to get some of what we get from the U.S. will continue. The U.S. has been very generous and very supportive in many ways, but also in supplying the ammunition and what we needed in order to defend ourselves during this war. The U.S. has also been generous in granting this $14.2 billion in
supplemental aid.
Right, supplemental defense aid. So I think that has been very crucial. And of course, on top of that was the help in actually dealing with the missile attack from Iran. And I think there are a lot of ways in which the U.S. has been very supportive.
April 13th, 14th, from the outside looking in, it looked like a glimpse into the future. This is what the Middle East could be, that on the same team as the U.S., Britain, France, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan. It looked like almost a messianic kind of thing that all these countries would come together to help defend Israel against an Iranian missile attack.
That's right. And so I think the support by the U.S. in assembling this coalition, I think, was and is really tremendous. I think it's a really strategic sort of support over the longer run.
And the fact you mentioned the $14.2 billion from Congress, Israel's economy might look a little different if it didn't have that kind of aid coming in. I have to believe it's helped the Israeli economy at a difficult time.
Definitely, but the current increase in the cost of the defense budget has been something around $32 billion.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Right.
What is the difference from pre-war to war?
Right. So it's estimated now at about 118 billion shekels, which is about $32 billion. But that's just the direct
What was it
effect
before?
Of the war.
What was it before?
It was about half of that. It
Really?
actually more or less doubled.
Wow.
Yeah. But we're talking now only about the direct effect of the war. And by the way, it assumes that the war will end by the end of this year or something like that. It doesn't take into account the possibility of further escalation in the north.
Right. Israel has started out as Sparta, and it seems like the last few decades, it looks more like Athens in terms of the flowering of all these different parts of the Israeli economy and the like. To go back to Sparta is not easy. When Israel in the early days was a collectivized state, a garrison democracy, now we have people with all these options. How do you balance this? If you double the defense budget, assuming it doesn't end today because there could be the North, and then there's going to be costs post-conflict, more and more taxes, that has its own negative fallout. Politicians don't like to raise taxes on their public. So how does Israel cope with this new situation economically?
Well, actually, this is an issue that now there was a special committee set up in order to define what should be the defense budget over the longer run. Not the part that is the direct cost of the war, but what should be the size of the military and what should be the long-term defense budget. And I hope that within the considerations, they will really look for the balance between the needs of the military and the needs for the society and the economy, because you have to make sure that you have a strong enough economy and society in order to be able to actually bear the burden of additional defense spending. And it's a very difficult task. I think it's very important to maintain the investment in the engines of growth, which are basically will ensure that the potential of the economy to grow continues. It's very important that tax burdens are such that they will not be so high as to make the people that are most productive and have the best options outside actually leave. That's definitely a risk. And we have to maintain our competitiveness, so the marginal taxes cannot be raised too much. I think one of the things that are difficult politically would be to enlarge or broaden the tax base, because we have a relatively narrow tax base, which means we have our income tax is very progressive. At the top, you pay very high marginal tax, but 55% of employees don't get to the threshold, so they don't pay any income tax. I think what we will have to do is expand the tax base so that more people actually pay. Because if you'll try to get much more taxes off the top is the most movable, the people that can actually leave.
Are you worried about a brain drain for Israel? I mean,
I'm definitely worried about a brain drain. I think that our most innovative, technologically advanced, educated people are courted by other countries that are offering them very attractive contracts. And I think that if the burden of military service in reserve and taxes become very difficult, I think some people may decide to either move or move their business. Instead of listing their startups in Israel, they may list them somewhere else because it's going to be easier and easier to mobilize resources. So that's definitely a risk. And I think that when one aspect of thinking about the future burden of the defense has to take that into account. And we have to have an approach of risk management. As in everything, we have to do a risk management. You can't completely neutralize one risk, but have much heavier risks in other areas.
We had Yochanan Plessner, who was a colleague of yours, the president of the Israel Democracy Institute, talking about the ultra-Orthodox. And when you talk about broadening the base, and often when you talk about burden sharing, it's about the reserve duty, that Israel needs more reservists. I have to believe it's also a question of getting more of the ultra-Orthodox into the workforce and cutting out some of the subsidies that go to keep their lifestyle in a certain way. I just wonder if this war could be a catalyst to restructure things a bit. You're going to need a broader base because, like you said, the defense budget is doubled and it's not going to end. I mean, God willing, the war ends, but there will be a lot of costs still to come.
Even before the war, the fact that a proportion of the ultra-Orthodox is growing fast.
The fastest in the Israeli society.
Right. Meant that we will have to make much more progress in actually integrating the ultra-Orthodox into the labor market, which has been happening very, very slowly. Actually, ultra-Orthodox women now are much more integrated and their participation rate has gone up quite substantially. But with ultra-Orthodox men, the progress is very slow.
Despite all these efforts for vocational training and remedials.
Because I think that you can't really make up for the 5 years when people don't get any basic core curriculum in any vocational training. You can't learn English in 6 months. You can't learn math. You can sort of learn very basic things. Now, the main issue that I see right now is that the government so far has not been able to actually reprioritize the budget. In fact, one of the very disappointing things that happened was that when the budget for 2024 was revised in order to meet the needs resulting from the war, there was not a decision to actually eliminate all these extra allowances that were given to the ultra-Orthodox and to some other interests that are represented in the coalition. Special allocations that they received as part of the coalition agreement were not eliminated.
Right.
In fact, most of them are still there, which, by the way, makes it much more difficult to come to the rest of the public and demand,
They sacrifice more. When the media is certainly highlighting the fact that these coalition parties are not saying, oh, we don't need the money, I mean, they're saying, hey, they get their share, but you should sacrifice more.
So there are two issues. One is that in these allocations, there is a very substantial sum going to the educational system of the ultra-Orthodox that doesn't provide them with the very basic skills to be able to actually then get into the labor market in any reasonable way. And that doesn't go in the right direction. It goes exactly in the opposite direction. That's one issue. And the other issue is the fact that these members of the coalition were not giving up some of what is dear to them makes it very difficult to come to the rest of the public and demand, that they bear more of the burden.
Because they don't seem to be leading by example. Your point about you can't learn English in 6 months. I spoke to a Haredi guy who a lot of his friends and him went to one of these programs that I think the Technion tried to put together, which was trying to fast track people. And he said him and all of his Haredi friends, they all dropped out. He said, these kids have been learning, math since first grade. And we're supposed to learn it in 6 months? Impossible.
There are preparatory programs in the universities, and the dropout rate is very, very high for the Haredim, I mean. And that's why I think if we want to see a change, there should be a complete linkage between teaching all the core curriculum and any allocations from the budget to the educational Haredi system. As long as that doesn't happen, we're in a very negative direction.
There's this academic from the Shoresh Institute.
Dan Ben David.
Dan Ben David.
Yeah.
I've seen his presentations, and it's scary. It says, look, you have this very first world Israeli economy, high tech, and they are carrying Israel forward, and yet there are parts of the society that are not getting that kind of education from their own choice, maybe, but it's not, the kids' choice. It's their parents' choice or the rabbi's choice or whatever it is. But the future of Israel seems like if you don't have the educational escalator, what's going to be?
Yeah, I think it's very worrisome. In fact, before this coalition was formed, there was an agreement that was almost completed to actually get a substantial part of the Haredi community, to get them to have core curriculum in their studies, and in exchange for that to get allocation. And then in the current agreement, this condition was waived.
From my understanding, you had something called the Belz Hasidim,
Exactly.
which are a very big group among the Hasidic ultra-Orthodox group that wanted the core curriculum, what everyone's been waiting for. English, math, being able to have skills for the 21st century. And the ultra-Orthodox party said if the Belz goes forward, they're kicked out of the Haredi parliamentary factions of United Torah Judaism. And the net effect is that unraveled. It's devastating when you see something like this because the people who are the victims are children. Often they're not going to have the skills. It's like dooming another generation to poverty. Let me just move it over to the Palestinian side for a moment without getting into why Israel conducted the war the way it did. Just on the West Bank, people say, look, because of October the 7th, there was a security fear of the workers coming in. Like I said, they're allowed to go to settlements, but not to Green Line Israel. How do we see the implications of this for the economy in the West Bank?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on the West Bank economy,
Yeah.
but what I can say is their economy is very dependent and interlinked with the Israeli economy. And normally, before the war, they would get something like 800 million shekels a month as tax receipts that
Right.
are transferred to
Right.
them. Now it's less than half of that. And before the war, they had something around 120,000 workers working in Israel in construction and
Yeah.
agriculture. Now it's about 20,000. And those were the highest paid relatively. Obviously, the effects of the war are really extreme on the Palestinian economy. The last figures that I've seen was that unemployment soared to 32%, partly because the Palestinian Authority now can't pay the wages of some of the workers that were employed by them. And GDP, which was on a growth trend of around 4% in 2023 in the first three quarters, actually shrunk by 19% in the last quarter of 2023. So the overall figure for 2023 was a decline of 2%. Given that the population there grows, it means that even sharper decline in per capita income. So the effects are extremely devastating for the Palestinian economy.
Do you think that Israel could live without the Palestinian workers, with all these bringing in others from abroad?
I think over the longer run, if that would be the expectation that there will not be Palestinian workers coming to Israel, there could be a change in the technological ways of production. That probably construction will become more technological, and Israelis could be trained and foreign workers would be brought in. But it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight.
So my last area I just want to raise is, you mentioned the resilience of the Israeli people and hope that this war is going to end soon. How do you see the bounce back of the Israeli economy? And we keep hearing about AI, and in America, you can't turn on the CNBC, the business channel. Every sentence is AI, AI, AI. Israel certainly sees itself with its great success of the startup nation. How confident are you about Israel's high-tech future when it comes to AI as a key element, and who else is Israel competing with on that stage? Do you have hope for the economy to bounce back, or you just say, David, this is going to take a long time? Keep expectations lower than the Dead Sea, because it might take years for the economy to bounce back.
I think we're at the stage of huge uncertainty. If I look at the past, Israel bounced back very nicely from previous rounds of violence and from previous global shocks. Following COVID-19, the Israeli economy bounced back in I think, the strongest among all advanced economies. Global financial crisis had a relatively small effect and the economy bounced back. The 2000 Intifada was relatively long.
Went for 4 years.
Yeah. So the
How long
story
did it
there
take
was,
Israel to bounce back after that?
it was more gradual. But
Really?
if we take the Second Lebanon War, which
Right.
took place in the last quarter of 2006, when you look at the annual figures, you hardly see any effect because the recovery was very strong. And that's true also for the rounds of violence that were
With Gaza after 2008-9, 2012, 2014, 2021.
Exactly. And I think the economy has some basic strengths and basic elements of resilience that help it actually deal with shocks and recover quickly. It includes the fact that we have a current account deficit, we have strong macroeconomic management, we have very strong financial institutions. The banks are well capitalized.
Right. Foreign reserves are high.
Foreign reserves are more than $200 billion, and so on and so forth. And all of these things, by the way, are always mentioned by the credit rating agencies as areas of strength. The issue is now that the war has been much, much longer. The costs are very high, and the potential burden of future defense budget, which will be much higher, is a serious risk of crowding out actually spending on the engines of growth. So that may weaken the potential growth, and that will probably mean that this risk of prolonged effect is much higher.
In Israel, suddenly everyone got into ratings of these credit agencies, Fitch, S&P, Moody's. So when one says, well, we got some concerns and we might go from AAA to AA or whatever, do you think this might take time?
I hope so. It's obviously going to take more time because the war is much, much longer. And also we know that the budgetary effects are longer, so it will depend how it's handled. But I think there are some basic sort of forces of resilience in the economy. And if we avoid major policy mistakes, I think there is a good chance for recovery. I looked at some numbers. And there was a recent study which was published in June by the Israeli Innovation Authority, looking exactly at the question of how is Israel relative to other countries in the area of generative AI. And it turns out actually that we're doing quite okay. We have 73 companies that are creating advanced AI models that focus on specific fields, and that ranks us number 3 in the world. And in some other areas, we're also ranked quite high. So actually, Israel seems to have quite a lot of startups in this area of developing AI. The question, of course, is whether we will continue to invest enough in the infrastructure that is necessary in order to really do well in this area. And it brings me back to the question of not crowding out the engines of growth, which is key to making sure that the economy does bounce back and sort of, utilizes its potential.
Well, I think that's very sound advice when you refer to the resilience that is kind of built into Israel, of the economy and of the people of Israel. It gives us hope that at a bleak time that there's a lot of light still ahead. So I really want to thank you very much, Professor Karnit Flug, for joining us today on Decision Points.
Thank you very much for having me.
We just had an insightful conversation with Karnit Flug. I thought it was a particularly interesting conversation because the economic dimension of the war is often overlooked. Economic challenges often take a back seat to pressing security and societal tolls of conflict. Yet this is one of Israel's longest wars that it has fought since it was founded in 1948. So it's to be seen if Israel will bounce back as quickly as it has from previous rounds of conflict. Israel's current economic situation definitely intersects with societal challenges. The economy is integral to issues like population displacement, rebuilding communities, integrating the ultra-Orthodox, known as Haredim, and preventing brain drain. These effects of the war on Israel's economy, both those known and unknown, beg the question, what should Israel do to cope? For any potential solution, Israel, of course, will need to balance its needs, those of its military, its society, and its economy. Of course, the costs are not just to Israel, but the rebuilding of Gaza, the employment in the West Bank. This is a dimension that will involve the Middle East and beyond, maybe the whole world. Finally, we cannot discuss the Israeli economy without considering the Israeli people. And in the coming months and years, this will be a test for their resilience. They're proud always of their resilience, and this will test them in a different way. The war has not yet ended, and yet the economic challenges will be with Israel for a long time to come. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Decision Points. Thank you to my dedicated team of research assistants at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I want to thank Rena Gaber, Simone Sadmeyer, Sydney Hilbush, and Gabriel Epstein. I also want to thank Rob, Hadia, and the production team at Podville Media, and listeners like you for making this podcast possible. Please leave us a 5-star review so we can continue to grow this community. Subscribe to Decision Points on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, or wherever you get your podcasts. To our listeners from all over the world, thank you for listening to this season of Decision Points.